the board gaming debate. And it is somewhat of a debate because things have shifted enough now compared to many, many years ago. Standees, board game standees versus miniatures. Your thought. What delivers a better experience? Now, I have to be honest. Wargamer Fritz, miniatures, lots and lots of miniatures. For the longest time, I was kind of like, must be miniatures. I jumped into board gaming around 2008. Before that, playing war games, Warhammer 40K, DBA, DBN, Dungeons and Dragons, playing with full miniatures. I mean, just boatloads and buckets of miniatures. And on a side note, what made the jump into board games? I mean, I had Space Hulk, I had a few titles, but what made the jump to board games was the fact that was around the shift, around like 2010, 2012. That was the shift where now you started to see all of these games pumping out massive amounts of miniatures. And I started to notice that many of the board games were essentially evolving into miniature games. And now when I can't play at the club, so I'm playing at the gaming club, twice a week. I'm gaming on Saturdays. I'm running my D&D thing on Fridays. The times that I couldn't play, now I can pull out a board game and push around miniatures. So that was actually my jump in to miniature board gaming and the board gaming universe. And now it's just completely taken over in so many aspects. And that's fantastic. But now we see essentially miniatures. And early on it was just, here's like 100 miniatures, think Zombicide. Now the next jump up is we're going to do colossal, heroic scale miniatures. So you have your normal miniatures, but now you have some massive, huge pieces. And the production quality is fantastic. We're seeing production quality in miniatures that, in my mind, would have only been seen if I look at pieces in my own collection over the years. Current miniatures that are well done in some mass market, mass-produced games are similar to resin miniatures from years ago. I mean, the quality and level of detail is amazing. These are mass-produced board game miniatures. They're not boutique KDM miniatures or Warhammer 40,000 Games Workshop models. They're really good. They're amazing. And the great thing about miniatures was, and is, it pulls you into the 3D of the game. It takes it from a 2D level, puts it to a 3D level. I like interacting with miniatures as a board gamer. I like looking at the board, asking questions, imagining in my mind what's going to happen next turn, planning it out. I like picking up the dice. I've got a few card titles in there. Rolling the dice and seeing and pushing the miniatures, the feedback. I mean, it's really amazing with how it works. And if you have the ability to paint your miniatures to take it to that next level, I'm not going to say it's required. That's a vlog podcast for another time. But if you paint them, it takes it even to the next level. So do we even need standees anymore? I mean, it used to be the evolution was you had games with little tokens and markers, and then the idea of a standee, cardboard cutout figure with a little stand to take it 3D. You very rarely see that anymore. Fritz, what about Gloomhaven? What about Frosty? Yes, you see it in certain titles where beyond just miniatures, an example like Zombicide Black Plague, there are a lot of miniatures. Invader, a lot of miniatures. Conan, a lot of miniatures. But a small enough variety. Look at Gloomhaven. To print all of the monsters in miniatures, the cost would be well over $100 USD. So I understand that in some very, very boutique areas, there are still standees. But if we take that out, you really don't see standees that much anymore. Immediately in the comments, right? There's like, hey, Fritz, there's these 10 games with standees. Right, but it's mostly miniatures. But now on the opposite end, there's a couple of games that I've recently acquired that have just standees only. And they're new games. They're new production games. So that was kind of like my old thinking, the old Fritz thinking. Now in looking at it, these games, the action is centered around movement, markers, and maps. So it's not kind of a war game or a skirmish game or a miniature game. It's more like, hey, here's what's going on in the realm, and here's like 2 or 3 markers. And I find that if the game is a slower pace, if the game is a little bit more narrative, story-driven as opposed to like dice combat, I actually like the standees because a standee, you can make it bigger. If the artwork is vivid, if the artwork is done correct, if the artwork ties into the theme of the cards, the maps, the components, it evokes a different feeling. It adds to the narrative in some ways better than a sea of gray miniatures. Now, kind of the footnote is if you paint your own miniatures, that blows Standees out of the water. Yes, absolutely, but not everyone has the capacity right now to paint their miniatures, and that's okay. You know, we're kind of approaching this from an NP, non-painting perspective. But having Standees to look at a game as a narrative unfolds, when done right, I think the Standees can be better than the miniatures. So now I'm kind of at the point where I look and say, Standees versus miniatures, in my mind, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys in the comments, really depends on the rule set, really depends on the narrative. And I'm going to use like 2 examples. If it's a fast-paced game, like Zombicide, it needs miniatures. Zombicide would never work with tokens or Standees. But if it's more tactical, more positioning, more like a story-type game, storyboard, fantasy game, then those Standees give you the 3D on the map, pull you to that point, remind you, pull you into the story. I think miniatures would actually possibly take away from that because they're not painted. Pre-paint somewhere in the middle. Or again, if you have the ability to paint your own. Your thoughts on Standees versus miniatures? Yes, no, one or the other? Or do you kind of agree it really, really depends on the DNA, the rules, the narrative, kind of all these factors, and that indeed it depends on those factors where a game might be better suited for miniatures or it might be better suited for Standees?